After years of sacrifice to build his business empire, 72-year-old Robert Morrison faces the ultimate betrayal at Christmas dinner when his daughter Sarah openly mocks his old, worn shoes in front of the entire family. What she doesn't know is that her father has been secretly battling a terminal illness and has already made decisions about his inheritance that will change everything. When the will is read after his passing, Sarah discovers that her cruelty has cost her more than she could have ever imagined. I never thought a pair of old shoes could reveal so much about a person's character, but sitting at that Christmas dinner table, watching my daughter Sarah's face twist with embarrassment as she stared at my feet, I realized I had been blind to who she really was for far too long. The brown leather shoes on my feet were indeed old, 15 years old to be exact. They had walked me through countless business meetings, carried me up the steps of my first office building, and stood beside me as I built Morrison Industries from nothing into a multi-million-dollar empire. The leather was cracked in places, the soles worn thin, but they were still perfectly functional. More than that, they were a reminder of where I came from. Dad, seriously. Sarah's voice cut through the warm chatter of Christmas dinner like a knife through silk. Those shoes are absolutely ancient. You're embarrassing us. The dining room fell silent. My wife, Margaret, God rest her soul, had passed away 3 years ago, so it was just me, Sarah, her husband David, my grandson Tommy, who was home from college, and my younger daughter Lisa with her family. 8 people around the mahogany table that Margaret had picked out 20 years ago, and suddenly I felt completely alone. Sarah continued, her voice getting louder and more pointed. I mean, look at them. They're falling apart. You're worth millions of dollars and you show up to Christmas dinner looking like a homeless person. I felt something crack inside my chest, and it wasn't just from the cancer that had been quietly eating away at my lungs for the past 8 months. The doctors had given me 6 months to live back in April. Here it was, December, and I was still fighting, still here for what I somehow knew would be my last Christmas with my family. They're just shoes, Sarah, I said quietly, cutting a small piece of the ham that Lisa had spent hours preparing. Just shoes? She laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Dad, you own 3 houses, drive a Mercedes, and you're sitting here in shoes that belong in a garbage can. What will people think? That's when something inside me shifted. I looked around the table at the faces of my family. Lisa was staring at her plate, clearly uncomfortable. Her husband Mike was studying his wine glass like it contained the secrets of the universe. My grandson Tommy looked confused and embarrassed. David, Sarah's husband, was nodding along with his wife like a bobblehead doll. What people, Sarah? I asked, setting down my fork. We're family. This is Christmas dinner in my home. What people are you worried about? You know what I mean, she said, waving her hand dismissively. You have an image to maintain. We all do. When you dress like that, it reflects on all of us. I took a slow sip of wine, buying myself time to think. The medication I was taking for the pain made everything feel slightly hazy, but this moment was crystal clear. This was my daughter, the little girl I had worked 16-hour days to provide for, the child I had sent to the finest private schools, whose college education I had paid for in full, whose wedding had cost me more than most people make in a year. These shoes, I said, lifting one foot slightly. I bought these the day I signed the contract for the Morrison building downtown. Do you remember that day, Sarah? She rolled her eyes. Dad, please don't start with the stories. But I wasn't done. I was so nervous that morning. Your mother made me breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, just like every morning. I was wearing my one good suit and these brand new shoes that I'd saved up to buy. They cost me $200, which was more than I'd ever spent on anything for myself. Tommy, my grandson, was listening now. At 19, he was the only one who still seemed genuinely interested in family history. The meeting was at 9 a.m., I continued, but I got there at 7:30 and walked around the block 12 times in these shoes. By the time I walked into that conference room, they felt like old friends. And when I shook hands with the investors who would change our lives forever, these shoes were what carried me forward. Sarah sighed dramatically. That's a lovely story, Dad, but I'm not finished, I said, and something in my voice made her stop. Maybe it was the weight of authority I'd developed over decades of running a company, or maybe it was something else, something that sensed this conversation was more important than she realized. Every major decision in my life I've made while wearing these shoes. The day I bought our first house, the day I expanded the business to 3 states, the day I walked you down the aisle at your wedding, Sarah. These shoes have been with me through every triumph and every heartbreak. I could see Lisa nodding slightly. She understood. She had always been different from Sarah, more thoughtful, more appreciative of the journey rather than just the destination. "They're still just old shoes," Sarah muttered, but her voice had lost some of its earlier venom. "No," I said, looking directly at her. "They're a reminder of who I am and where I came from. They remind me that success isn't about having the newest, most expensive things. It's about the journey, the work, the relationships you build along the way." I paused, thinking about the envelope in my desk drawer upstairs, the one containing my updated will that I'd had my lawyer prepare just 2 weeks ago. The cancer was spreading faster than the doctors had expected, and I knew I didn't have much time left. But I hadn't told my family about my illness. I wanted to see who they really were when they thought I'd be around forever. "These shoes have walked me through 45 years of marriage to your mother," I continued. "They've paced hospital corridors when you girls were born, when your mother was sick, when your grandfather had his heart attack. They've stood beside graves and at altars, in boardrooms and in soup kitchens where your mother and I used to volunteer every Christmas Eve." The room was completely quiet now. Even David had stopped nodding and was actually listening. "But most importantly," I said, my voice growing softer, "these shoes have taught me that the value of something isn't measured by its price tag or its appearance. It's measured by its purpose, its history, its meaning." Sarah's face was red now, whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. "You're being ridiculous, Dad. They're falling apart." "So am I said quietly. And for a moment I almost told them everything, almost revealed the diagnosis, the prognosis, the reason why every Christmas decoration, every family laugh, every shared meal felt so precious and final. Instead, I stood up slowly, my 72-year-old joints protesting. "I think I need some air." As I walked toward the back door, my old shoes silent on the hardwood floor that Margaret had insisted on installing, I heard Tommy's voice. "I think Grandpa's shoes are cool. They have character." And Sarah's sharp response, "Don't encourage him, Tommy. He needs to start acting his age and his social status." I stepped out onto the back porch, the December air sharp in my lungs. The cold felt good against the constant low-grade fever that had become my companion these past months. I could see my reflection in the sliding glass door, a tall, still strong man with silver hair and, yes, old shoes that had carried me through a lifetime of experiences my daughter couldn't begin to understand. Inside, I could hear the conversation resume, but the warmth was gone. Sarah was talking about some charity gala she was organizing, the kind of event where appearances mattered more than actual charity. Lisa was asking Tommy about his college classes, trying to restore some normalcy to the evening. I thought about Margaret, about how she would have handled this situation. She would have given Sarah one of those looks, the kind that could stop a charging bull, and said something like, "A person's worth isn't measured by the shine on their shoes, sweetheart." But Margaret was gone, and I was left to navigate these family dynamics alone, while carrying the secret that I wouldn't be around much longer to navigate anything at all. The back door slid open, and Lisa stepped out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Dad, you okay?" I smiled at my younger daughter, the one who had inherited her mother's compassion along with her eyes. "Just needed a moment, sweetheart." She came and stood beside me, not saying anything for a while. That was Lisa's gift, knowing when silence was more valuable than words. Finally, she spoke. "Sarah's been under a lot of stress with the kids and David's work situation." I nodded, appreciating her attempt to make excuses for her sister, even though we both knew this wasn't about stress. This was about values, about character, about what really mattered in life. "Your shoes do have a lot of history," Lisa said softly. "They do indeed." I put my arm around her shoulder. "Sometimes I think they know me better than I know myself." We stood there for a few more minutes, father and daughter, watching our breath form small clouds in the cold air. Inside, I could hear Sarah's laughter, high and brittle, probably telling some story about her social circle. The sound made my chest ache, and not from the cancer. When we went back inside, dinner was nearly over. Sarah avoided my eyes, but she was animated, talking about her plans for New Year's Eve, some exclusive party at the country club. The conversation had moved on, but something fundamental had shifted. I could feel it in the air, see it in the way Tommy kept glancing at my shoes, with something that looked like respect. Notice it in the way David seemed less sure of himself than usual. As the evening wound down and families began to leave, Sarah approached me in the hallway. "Dad," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings earlier. I worry about what people think." I studied her face, looking for genuine remorse, but what I saw was the same concern about appearances that had driven her comments in the first place. She wasn't sorry for hurting me. She was sorry that her behavior might have consequences. "I know you do, sweetheart," I said, kissing her cheek. "That's exactly the problem." The days following Christmas dinner passed like a slow-motion film reel in my mind. I kept replaying Sarah's words, the look of disgust on her face when she stared at my shoes, the way she seemed more concerned about her image than her father's feelings. But what haunted me most wasn't her cruelty. It was my own silence about the cancer that was slowly claiming my life. I sat in Dr. Henderson's office 3 days after Christmas, the familiar antiseptic smell filling my nostrils as he delivered news I already knew was coming. "Robert, I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Dr. Henderson said, his kind eyes heavy with concern. "The latest scans show the cancer has spread to your liver. We're looking at weeks now, maybe a month or two at most." I nodded, my hands resting on my knees. The same hands that had built an empire, that had held my daughters as babies, that had comforted Margaret during her final days. Soon, they would be still forever. "Have you told your family yet?" he asked gently. "No," I admitted. I needed to understand who they really were before." Dr. Henderson leaned forward. "Robert, they deserve to know. They deserve the chance to say goodbye, to spend time with you while they can." "Do they?" The question came out harsher than I intended. My oldest daughter was more concerned about my appearance at Christmas dinner than asking how I was feeling. She hasn't called once since then to check on me. The doctor was quiet for a moment. He'd been treating my family for years, had delivered both my daughters, had held Margaret's hand when we received her diagnosis. "People process things differently," he said finally. "Sometimes fear makes us focus on the wrong things." I left the hospital that grey December afternoon with a new prescription for pain medication and a clearer understanding of my timeline. The drive home in my Mercedes, the car Sarah was so proud of, felt surreal. Here I was, a dying man in an expensive car, and all I could think about were my old brown shoes sitting by the front door. The house felt enormous and empty when I walked in. Margaret's presence still lingered in every room, her favorite throw pillow on the couch, her reading glasses on the kitchen counter that I couldn't bring myself to move, her garden tools still hanging in the garage. She would have known what to do about Sarah. She always knew what to do. I made myself a simple dinner, soup and crackers, and ate it at the kitchen island where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals. The silence was deafening. My phone rang at 8:30. "Lisa." "Hi, Dad. Just checking in. How are you feeling?" The genuine concern in her voice almost broke me. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired." "Did you have a good day?" I thought about lying, about saying I'd spent the day reading or watching television. Instead, I found myself saying, "I had a doctor's appointment." "Oh, everything okay? Just a routine checkup?" The question hung in the air like smoke. This was my chance. I could tell her everything, the diagnosis, the prognosis, the fact that her father was dying, and she deserved to know. But something held me back. "Just routine," I said. "You know how it is at my age." We talked for another 20 minutes about her kids, her husband Mike's promotion at work, her plans for New Year's Eve. Normal, everyday conversation that felt both precious and painful. When we hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time, wondering if I'd just made a terrible mistake. The next morning, I drove to my office for what I knew would be one of my final times. Morrison Industries occupied 3 floors of the downtown building that bore my name, and walking through those familiar corridors felt like traveling through my own biography. 42 years of my life were contained in these walls. My assistant, Patricia, had been with me for 18 years. She greeted me with her usual warm smile, but I could see the concern in her eyes. "Mr. Morrison, you look tired. Are you sure you should be working today?" Patricia knew. She'd worked for me long enough to read my moods, to notice the subtle changes in my appearance, the way I'd been delegating more responsibilities to my executive team. She was too professional to ask directly, but her motherly instincts were in full display. "I'm fine, Patricia. Could you please ask James to come to my office? I need to discuss the Henderson project with him." James Murphy had been my second in command for over a decade. He was brilliant, ethical, and completely capable of running the company when I was no longer able to do so. As he settled into the chair across from my desk, I realized this conversation was going to be harder than I'd anticipated. "James, I need to discuss something important with you." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Of course, Robert. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, my fingers drumming against the desk, a nervous habit Margaret had always teased me about. "I'm going to be stepping back from day-to-day operations soon, sooner than we originally planned." "I see." His voice was carefully neutral. "May I ask why?" This was the moment. I could tell him the truth, prepare him properly for the transition. But looking at James, I realized that telling him would make it real in a way that I wasn't quite ready for. "I'm 72 years old," I said instead. "It's time to let the younger generation take over." We spent the next hour discussing the transition plan, reviewing key clients and ongoing projects. James asked intelligent questions and offered thoughtful suggestions, but I could see he wasn't entirely convinced by my explanation. He knew me well enough to sense there was more to the story. After he left, I sat alone in my office looking out at the city I'd helped build. Dozens of buildings bore the Morrison Industries mark: hotels, office complexes, residential developments. My legacy was written across the skyline, but what did that matter if my own daughter valued appearances over authenticity? My phone buzzed with a text message. "Sarah, Dad, David and I are having dinner at the club tonight. Want to join us 7:30 p.m. The country club, of course, the place where appearances mattered most, where she could show off her successful father to her social circle. I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. "Thank you for the invitation, I'll be there." I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing financial documents and making notes for Patricia about various matters that would need attention. As 5 o'clock approached, I made a decision that would have seemed trivial to anyone else, but felt monumental to me. I drove home and went straight to my closet. Hanging there were dozens of expensive suits, rows of Italian leather shoes, silk ties that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. At the very end of the row sat my old brown shoes, polished, but clearly showing their age. I put them on. The country club was exactly what I expected: crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, members dressed in their finest attire. Sarah and David were already seated when I arrived, and I could see Sarah's face change the moment she spotted my shoes. "Dad," she said, forcing a smile as I approached the table. "So glad you could make it." But her eyes were fixed on my feet, and I could practically see her internal struggle. Should she say something? Should she pretend not to notice? Should she ask me to go home and change? David stood to shake my hand, his grip firm but his eyes also drifting downward. "Robert, good to see you." As we settled into our seats, I noticed the subtle way Sarah angled herself to try to hide my shoes under the table. She was already scanning the room, checking to see if anyone she knew was watching. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice bright but strained. "Productive," I said, accepting a menu from the waiter. "I had some important meetings at the office. We ordered our meals. Sarah insisted on the most expensive items on the menu, as if the cost of dinner could somehow compensate for her father's footwear. As we waited for our food, she launched into a detailed account of her day, which seemed to consist primarily of shopping and planning for an upcoming charity luncheon. And then I ran into Margaret Thornton. "You remember, she's married to the bank president, and she mentioned that her husband might be looking to invest in some new development projects," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. "I thought maybe you could reach out to him." This was classic Sarah. Everything was a networking opportunity, every conversation a chance to advance her social standing or financial position. She had learned to see people as assets rather than human beings, and I wondered when that transformation had occurred. "I'm not taking on any new projects," I said quietly. She looked surprised. "Why not? Business is good, isn't it? Business is fine. I'm just focusing on other things right now." Our dinner arrived and we ate in relative silence. I could feel Sarah's tension radiating across the table, could see her glancing around the dining room to monitor who might be looking at us. Every few minutes she would shift in her seat, trying to find an angle that better concealed my shoes. Finally, she couldn't contain herself anymore. "Dad, I don't understand why you insist on wearing those shoes. You could buy any shoes you wanted, the finest Italian leather, handcrafted, custom-made. Why cling to something so worn out?" I set down my fork and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. At 52, she was still beautiful, but there was something hard around her eyes, something calculating in the way she held herself. When had she become this person? When had my little girl, who used to beg me to read her bedtime stories, turned into someone who valued image over substance? "Sarah," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "let me ask you something. When you think about your childhood, what do you remember most?" She looked confused by the question. "I don't know. Lots of things." "Why? Do you remember the camping trips we used to take? Just you, me, Lisa, and your mother?" A small smile crossed her face. "Of course. We went to that lake in Colorado every summer for years. Do you remember what shoes I wore on those trips?" She thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. "Your hiking boots, I suppose. Old beat-up hiking boots that I refused to replace even when your mother insisted. And do you remember why?" Sarah was quiet, perhaps beginning to see where this conversation was heading. Because they were broken in perfectly. They never gave me blisters, never made my feet hurt during long hikes. They had carried me up mountains and across streams, and they were reliable. I leaned forward. Just like these shoes have been reliable through every important moment of my adult life. David was listening intently now, perhaps sensing that this conversation was about more than footwear. The problem, Sarah, is that somewhere along the way, you've forgotten the difference between what's valuable and what's expensive, between what has meaning and what has status. Her face flushed red. That's not fair, Dad. I work hard for what we have. I never said you didn't, but working hard and living meaningfully aren't the same thing. The rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. Sarah picked at her food, clearly upset, while David tried to make small talk about sports and weather. As we prepared to leave, Sarah made one final attempt. Dad, I'm saying this because I love you. Those shoes make you look... She struggled for the right words. Like what, sweetheart? Like a man who values history over fashion? Like someone who understands that worth isn't measured by price tags? She didn't answer, but I could see the frustration in her eyes. As we walked to the parking lot, I realized that this might be one of our last conversations, and the thought filled me with a sadness so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. If this part of the story has touched your heart, I'd love to know from which place in the world you're reading this. The connection between fathers and daughters is universal, but the pain of feeling misunderstood by those we love most runs deeper than any ocean. Standing in that parking lot, watching Sarah and David drive away in their luxury sedan, I made a decision that would change everything. It was time to have a serious conversation with my lawyer about my will, and it was time to face the truth about what really mattered in the time I had left. The morning after dinner at the country club, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The pain medication made most days feel foggy, but this particular morning cut through the haze like sunlight through storm clouds. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I called my lawyer, William Stevens, at 8 a.m. sharp. Bill had been handling my legal affairs for over 20 years, had drafted my original will when the girls were still teenagers, and had updated it several times as my fortune grew. He was also one of the few people who knew about my cancer diagnosis. Robert, good morning, his familiar voice greeted me. How are you feeling? Like a man who needs to make some important decisions, I said. Can you come to the house today? I want to make some significant changes to my will. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Of course. This afternoon work for you? Say 2 o'clock? Perfect. And Bill, bring the latest financial statements. I want to review everything. After hanging up, I made myself breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast just like Margaret used to make, and sat at the kitchen table thinking about the conversation ahead. The house was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each second bringing me closer to decisions that would echo long after I was gone. I spent the morning walking through the house, really seeing it for perhaps the first time in years. Margaret's touches were everywhere. The way she'd arranged the books in the library, the family photos covering the mantelpiece, the garden visible through every window that she'd lovingly tended until her illness made it impossible. This house wasn't just a building. It was a repository of memories, a testament to a life well lived. In my study, I pulled out a photo album Margaret had put together for our 40th wedding anniversary. Page after page of family moments, birthdays, graduations, holidays, quiet Sunday afternoons. There were pictures of both girls as children, their faces bright with joy and innocence. Sarah at age 8, gap-toothed and grinning, helping me build a treehouse in the backyard. Lisa at 10, covered in flour after attempting to bake cookies for Father's Day. When had Sarah changed? When had that joyful little girl become someone who measured worth by appearance and status? I found the answer in a photograph from Sarah's high school graduation. She was 18, beautiful and confident, but there was something different in her eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. That was around the time she'd started dating the son of a prominent family, when she'd begun running with a crowd that valued connections over character. Bill arrived promptly at 2, carrying his familiar leather briefcase and wearing the slightly concerned expression he'd perfected over decades of legal practice. We settled in my study, the same room where I'd made countless business decisions, where I'd taught both girls to play chess, where Margaret and I had spent countless evenings reading together. Robert, before we begin, Bill said, settling into the chair across from my desk, I have to ask, are you certain about this timing? You seem different today, more resolved, but also sadder, I finished for him. Yes, I suppose I am. But clarity and sadness often go hand in hand, don't they? He nodded, understanding. Bill had been through his own share of family difficulties over the years. His own son had struggled with addiction, and we'd had many conversations about the complex relationship between love and accountability. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick folder of documents. I took a deep breath, my fingers unconsciously drumming against the desk, that nervous habit Margaret had always teased me about. "I want to make substantial changes to how my estate is distributed." "I see. What kind of changes?" "Sarah's behavior over the past few months, but particularly at Christmas dinner, has shown me something I didn't want to see. She's lost sight of what's truly important. She's become someone who values image over substance, appearance over authenticity." Bill listened without judgment, taking notes as I spoke. He'd witnessed enough family drama over the years to know that money often revealed people's true character in ways nothing else could. "I want to reduce Sarah's inheritance significantly," I continued. "Not eliminate it entirely. She's still my daughter and I still love her, but enough to send a message about values and priorities." "And Lisa?" "Lisa gets the bulk of it. She's always understood what matters. She asks about my health, not my image. She cares about family, not status." Bill was quiet for a moment, then said, "Robert, I have to ask, have you considered that this might be a permanent decision based on temporary emotions? Sarah's behavior at Christmas was certainly insensitive, but people can change." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking Margaret's garden. The roses were dormant now, winter bare, but still beautiful in their stark honesty. "Bill, I've been diagnosed with terminal cancer. I have maybe a month, possibly two. This isn't about temporary emotions. It's about who my daughters really are when they think no one is watching, when they believe their inheritance is secure." I turned back to face him and I could see the shock in his eyes. Despite knowing about my diagnosis, I don't think he'd fully grasped how advanced it was. "I'm sorry, Robert, I didn't realize—" "No one does, except you and Dr. Henderson. I haven't told the girls yet." "Jesus, Robert, why not?" I sat back down, suddenly feeling every one of my 72 years. "Because I wanted to see who they really were, not who they'd pretend to be if they knew I was dying." We spent the next 2 hours going through my estate in detail. The numbers were staggering even to me. 40-plus years of successful business had accumulated into a fortune worth over $30 million. Properties, investments, the business itself, personal assets. It was more money than most people could spend in several lifetimes. Under my original will, both daughters would have inherited equally. Now I was changing it so that Sarah would receive only $2 million, still more than enough to live comfortably, but a fraction of what she'd been expecting. Lisa would receive the bulk of the estate, including the family home and controlling interest in Morrison Industries. But the most significant change was what I planned to do with my shoe collection. "I want to leave Sarah my old brown shoes," I said. Bill looked up from his notes, clearly confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "My old brown shoes, the ones she was so embarrassed by at Christmas dinner. I want them specifically mentioned in the will, and I want a letter attached explaining why." "Robert, are you sure about this? It seems petty, maybe it is, but sometimes the smallest gestures carry the biggest messages." I walked over to my desk and pulled out a piece of paper. I'd been thinking about what to write in that letter all morning. "I want you to include this," I said, handing him the handwritten note. Bill read it silently, his expression growing more somber with each line. "Sarah, these shoes have walked me through every important moment of my adult life. They've stood in boardrooms and hospital corridors, at altars and grave sites, in the homes of the wealthy and the shelters of the poor. They've carried me through triumph and heartbreak, success and failure. What they've taught me is that true worth isn't measured by appearance or price, but by the journey they've taken and the purpose they've served. I hope someday you'll understand that the same is true for people. I love you, but I'm disappointed in who you've become. Perhaps these shoes will remind you of who you used to be, and who you still could be. Your father." "Robert," Bill said quietly, "this is going to devastate her." "Good. Maybe devastation will lead to reflection. Maybe reflection will lead to change." We finished the legal paperwork as the winter sun began to set outside my study windows. Bill gathered his documents and stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Have you thought about what you want to tell them? About your diagnosis?" "I'm working on that," I said, "but I think I want to record something, a video message, something they can have after I'm gone, something that explains my decisions." After Bill left, I sat alone in my study as darkness settled over the house. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, and I realized I hadn't eaten since breakfast, but I wasn't hungry. I was thinking about Sarah, about the little girl who used to curl up in my lap while I read her bedtime stories, who used to insist on wearing her best dress to church every Sunday, not because she cared about appearances, but because she said it made God happy. Where had that little girl gone? My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Lisa. Hi, Dad. Just calling to see how your day went. Her voice was warm, genuinely interested. This was who Lisa was. Someone who called just to check in, who cared about her father's daily experiences, who found joy in simple connections. It was a productive day, sweetheart. I made some important decisions. Oh, anything you want to talk about? For a moment, I considered telling her everything. About the cancer, about the changes to the will, about my growing realization that time was running out faster than I'd expected. But something held me back. Just business matters, I said. Nothing for you to worry about. We talked for another 15 minutes about her kids, about her work as a volunteer coordinator at the local food bank, about her plans for the weekend. Normal everyday conversation that felt precious beyond measure. After we hung up, I made my way to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed Margaret and I had shared for 45 years. Her side still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume, and I could almost feel her presence beside me. I think I'm doing the right thing, sweetheart, I said to the empty room, but it hurts more than I expected. I looked down at my old brown shoes, still on my feet despite the late hour. Tomorrow, I would start recording the video messages I wanted to leave for each daughter. Tomorrow, I would begin the difficult process of saying goodbye without actually saying goodbye. But tonight, I would sit in this quiet house and remember better times, when love was simple and family was everything, and a father's worth was measured not by his shoes, but by the size of his heart. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, tap the red button that says subscribe. It's free, and it helps me keep sharing these moments of truth about family, love, and the complicated relationships that define us all. The hardest decisions often come in our final moments, when we finally see clearly what matters most and what doesn't matter at all. 3 days after meeting with Bill, I woke up feeling weaker than usual. The cancer was progressing exactly as Dr. Henderson had predicted, and I could feel my body surrendering more each day. But my mind remained clear, focused on the task I'd set for myself, recording the video messages that would serve as my final words to both daughters. I decided to use my study for the recordings. The room held so much of our family's history. The chess set where I'd taught both girls to play, the bookshelf filled with volumes Margaret and I had collected over the years, the family photos that chronicled decades of birthdays, graduations, and holidays. If these were to be my last communications with my daughters, I wanted them surrounded by memories of better times. Patricia had helped me set up the video equipment the day before. My faithful assistant had worked for me long enough to read between the lines, and though I hadn't explicitly told her about my condition, her increased attentiveness and the way she lingered after our conversations suggested she understood this wasn't a routine project. The camera is ready whenever you are, Mr. Morrison, she'd said quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call. Now, sitting alone in my study with the camera positioned on my desk, I found myself struggling with where to begin. How do you encapsulate a lifetime of love, disappointment, hope, and heartbreak into a few minutes of video? How do you explain decisions that will hurt someone you love, even when those decisions come from a place of deeper love? I decided to record Sarah's message first, perhaps because it would be the more difficult of the two. I pressed the record button and looked directly into the camera lens, imagining Sarah's face on the other side. Hello, sweetheart. If you're watching this, it means I'm no longer with you and there are things I need to say that I couldn't find the courage to say while I was alive. I paused, my throat suddenly tight. Even in this one-sided conversation, talking to Sarah about difficult truths felt overwhelming. First, I want you to know that I love you. I have loved you from the moment you were born, through every stage of your life, and I will love you beyond my last breath. Nothing I'm about to say changes that fundamental truth. I stood up and walked to the window, still talking to the camera. But love sometimes requires difficult honesty, and I haven't been honest with you about my disappointment in some of your choices. The words came easier now, flowing from a place of deep sadness rather than anger. Do you remember when you were 8 years old, and we found that injured bird in the backyard? You insisted we take it to the veterinarian, even though I explained it might not survive. You said it didn't matter how much it cost or whether the bird was important enough. It was hurt, and that was all that mattered. I smiled at the memory, remembering the fierce determination in her young eyes. That little girl understood something that the woman you've become seems to have forgotten. that worth isn't measured by appearance or status or price tags. It's measured by compassion, by authenticity, by the content of one's character. I returned to my desk, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the chair back. The evening you mocked my shoes at Christmas dinner wasn't just about footwear, Sarah. It was about values. It was about what you've allowed yourself to become, someone who judges worth by surface appearances, who prioritizes image over substance. I had to stop for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of what I was saying. This wasn't how I'd imagined leaving things with my daughter. I've been battling terminal cancer for 8 months. I chose not to tell you or Lisa because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I'd be around forever. And what I saw, particularly that night at Christmas, broke my heart. The confession felt like a physical release, like setting down a burden I'd been carrying for too long. I've changed my will, Sarah. You'll find that your inheritance is significantly less than what you were expecting. Not because I love you less, but because I hope the shock of it will force you to reevaluate your priorities. I reached down and lifted one of my old brown shoes, holding it toward the camera. I'm leaving you these shoes, the ones that embarrassed you so much. They've walked me through every important moment of my adult life. Every triumph, every heartbreak, every decision that mattered. I hope they'll remind you that true value lies not in how something looks, but in the journey it has taken and the purpose it has served. I set the shoe down gently, my vision blurring with unshed tears. The little girl who cried over an injured bird is still inside you somewhere, sweetheart. I pray you'll find her again, before it's too late to matter. I stopped the recording and sat in silence for several minutes, emotionally drained. The hardest part was done, but now I had to find entirely different words for Lisa, words that conveyed not disappointment but gratitude and pride. After a brief break, I started the second recording. Hello, my dear Lisa. Like your sister, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and there are things I need you to know. The tone was immediately different, warmer, more conversational, like the many heart-to-heart talks we'd shared over the years. First, I want to thank you for being exactly who you are. In a world that often rewards superficiality, you've remained genuine. In a society that prioritizes wealth accumulation, you've chosen service to others. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become. I thought about Lisa's volunteer work at the food bank, her genuine interest in other people's well-being, the way she'd raised her children to value kindness over achievement. I've been fighting cancer for 8 months, and I chose not to tell you because I didn't want your final months with your father to be overshadowed by illness and medical appointments. I wanted our conversations to remain natural, authentic, and they did. Every phone call, every visit, every moment we shared reinforced what I already knew about your character. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf, running my fingers along the spines of books Margaret and I had collected. I'm leaving you the majority of my estate, including this house, and controlling interest in Morrison Industries. Not because you're the younger daughter, but because you've demonstrated the wisdom and compassion necessary to handle such responsibility. I pulled out a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a book I'd read to both girls when they were young. Do you remember when I read this to you and Sarah? You were 12, and afterward, you asked me why Atticus Finch defended Tom Robinson when everyone in town was against him. Do you remember what I told you? I smiled at the memory of Lisa's intense concentration as she wrestled with complex moral questions. I said that sometimes doing the right thing isn't the same as doing the popular thing. That real courage means standing up for your principles even when it costs you something. You've lived that lesson, sweetheart. Every day of your adult life, you've chosen principle over convenience, compassion over profit. I returned to my desk, the weight of what I was sharing settling heavily on my shoulders. The money I'm leaving you isn't just an inheritance, it's a responsibility. Use it to continue the work you're already doing to make the world a little better than you found it. Support causes that matter. Help people who need help, and remember that true wealth lies not in what you accumulate, but in what you give away. I paused, thinking about the practical aspects of what I was asking of her. I know this puts you in a difficult position with Sarah. She'll be angry, hurt, confused. But I need you to understand that my decisions weren't made in anger. They were made in love. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is allow their child to face the consequences of their choices. I looked directly into the camera, wishing I could see Lisa's face, wishing I could hold her hand as I shared these final thoughts. Take care of the family business, but more importantly, take care of the family. Be patient with your sister, she may surprise you yet. And remember that every day is a gift. Every relationship is precious, and every moment of genuine connection is worth more than all the money in the world. I ended the recording and sat back in my chair, emotionally exhausted but strangely at peace. The messages were imperfect, incomplete, but they captured the essential truths I needed my daughters to understand. That evening, Lisa called as she did most nights. "Hi, Dad. How was your day?" "Reflective," I said, which was certainly true. "I've been thinking a lot about family, about the legacy we leave behind." "That sounds pretty deep for a Thursday night," she said with a gentle laugh. "Everything okay?" For a moment, I considered telling her everything. The diagnosis, the timeline, the videos I'd just recorded. But something held me back. Perhaps the desire to preserve these normal conversations for as long as possible. "Just the musings of an old man," I said. "Tell me about your day." We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things. Her kids' school activities, her volunteer work, her plans for the weekend. Normal, everyday conversation that felt more precious than gold. After we hung up, I made my way slowly to the bedroom, my old shoes silent on the hardwood floors. Tomorrow I would give the memory cards to Bill with strict instructions about when and how they should be shared with my daughters. But tonight I would lie in the bed I'd shared with Margaret and think about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. A dying man who discovered that his greatest wealth lay not in his business empire, but in the daughter who'd chosen love over luxury, service over status, authenticity over appearance. What comes next is even stronger. And to not miss the ending, tap the subscribe button now. It's free and you'll be with me in every new story. The hardest truths often come wrapped in the deepest love, and sometimes the most difficult decisions are the ones that matter most. 2 weeks after recording the video messages, I could no longer deny that my body was failing rapidly. The pain had intensified despite the increased medication, and simple tasks like climbing the stairs to my bedroom had become monumental challenges. Dr. Henderson had been right about the timeline. I could feel myself running out of time. I was sitting in my study on a cold January morning when Patricia called. "Mr. Morrison, Sarah is here to see you. She seems upset about something." I glanced at the clock. 9:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. Sarah never visited during business hours unless something was seriously wrong. "Send her in, Patricia. And could you bring us some coffee?" Sarah appeared in my doorway moments later, and I could immediately see she was agitated. Her usually perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled, her makeup wasn't quite right, and she was clutching her purse like a lifeline. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an invitation. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" She took a deep breath, clearly struggling with how to begin. "I've been hearing things. Rumors about you stepping back from the business, about changes being made. David heard something at the club about James Murphy taking over more responsibilities." I studied my daughter's face, noting the genuine concern beneath her obvious anxiety. This was the first time in months she'd seemed worried about something other than appearances. "Business transitions happen gradually," I said carefully. "I'm 72 years old, Sarah. It's natural that I'd be delegating more responsibilities. But that's not all, is it?" Her voice was sharper now, more demanding. "There's something you're not telling us. You've been different, quieter. You barely ate anything at Christmas dinner and you seem tired all the time." I was surprised by her observation. Despite her focus on surface appearances, Sarah had apparently been paying more attention to my well-being than I'd realized. "I'm concerned about you, Dad. Really concerned." The sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw glimpses of the little girl who used to worry when I came home late from business trips, who would insist on checking my temperature when I had a cold. "What specifically are you worried about?" I asked. She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Your health, your behavior, the fact that you seem to be pulling away from everyone, and..." She hesitated, clearly struggling with her next words. "And what, sweetheart?" "And I keep thinking about that night at Christmas dinner, about what I said about your shoes. I've been replaying it over and over, and I realize I was horrible to you." The admission hung in the air between us like smoke. I could see the shame in her eyes, the genuine regret that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised me. "I don't know why I said those things," she continued, her voice getting smaller. "Well, that's not true. I do know why. I was embarrassed, worried about what people would think, and I took it out on you, but that doesn't make it right." I felt something shift in my chest, not the physical pain that had become my constant companion, but an emotional release I hadn't expected. "You hurt my feelings that night," I said quietly. "But more than that, you disappointed me. Not because of what you said about the shoes, but because of what your words revealed about your values." She nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I know. I've known it ever since that night. I just didn't know how to take it back. You can't take it back, Sarah, but you can learn from it. We sat in silence for several moments, and I found myself wrestling with a decision I hadn't expected to face. My plan had been to let my daughters discover my condition after my death, to let the will and the video messages speak for themselves. But sitting here, looking at my daughter's genuine remorse, I wondered if I'd been too harsh in my judgment. "Dad," Sarah said finally, "whatever's going on with you, whatever you're not telling us, I want you to know that I love you. Not your money, not your success, not your reputation. You, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who stayed up all night when I had pneumonia in 3rd grade, who walked me down the aisle at my wedding." The tears were flowing freely now, and I could see the little girl I remembered, the one who had cried over an injured bird, who had insisted that everything deserving of love was worth saving. "I've been selfish and shallow and worried about all the wrong things," she continued, "but please don't shut me out. Whatever you're facing, let me face it with you." I stood up slowly, my movement more labored than I wanted it to be, and walked around the desk to sit in the chair next to her. For the first time in months, I took her hand in mine. "Sarah, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be difficult to hear." Her grip tightened. "Okay. I've been fighting cancer for 8 months, lung cancer that has spread to my liver. The doctors have given me a few weeks, maybe a month at most." The color drained from her face so completely that for a moment I thought she might faint. "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "I was diagnosed in April. I chose not to tell you or Lisa because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I'd be around forever." She stared at me in shock, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process what I'd told her. 8 months? She finally managed. "You've been dealing with this alone for 8 months?" "Not entirely alone. Dr. Henderson, of course, and my lawyer, Bill Stevens. But yes, I've kept it from the family." "Oh, Dad." The words came out as a sob, and suddenly she was crying in earnest. Deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she'd kept buried for years. I put my arm around her shoulders, and for the first time since she'd become an adult, she didn't pull away. She leaned into me like she had as a child, and I felt my own tears beginning to fall. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against my shoulder. "For Christmas dinner, for being awful about your shoes, for caring about stupid things when you were suffering." "Shh," I said, stroking her hair like I had when she was small. "You didn't know, but I should have known. I should have been paying attention to you instead of worrying about what other people thought." We held each other for several minutes, and I realized this was the most genuine connection I'd had with Sarah in years. The superficial concerns had been stripped away, leaving only the essential truth of our relationship, a father and daughter who loved each other despite their differences. "What happens now?" she asked when her crying had subsided. "Now we tell Lisa and we figure out how to make the most of the time we have left." She pulled back to look at me, her eyes red but more focused than I'd seen them in months. "How long have you known about how much time?" Dr. Henderson was initially optimistic about having 6 months to a year, but the cancer has progressed more aggressively than expected. She was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Is that why you've been making changes at the company?" "Partly. I need to ensure Morrison Industries continues successfully after I'm gone." "And your will?" The question was asked quietly, without the grasping tone I might have expected from the old Sarah. I hesitated, thinking about the changes I'd made, about the video messages sitting in Bill's office, about the old brown shoes that would soon belong to her. "I have made some changes," I admitted, "but maybe some of those changes need to be reconsidered." She shook her head. "No, Dad, whatever you decided for good reasons. I trust your judgment, even if it's difficult to accept." This response surprised me more than anything else she'd said. The Sarah I thought I knew would have demanded details, would have argued about fairness, would have been primarily concerned about the financial implications. "I want to make up for lost time," she said. "However much time you have left, I want to spend it being the daughter you deserve, not the one I've been." We talked for another hour about practical matters, when and how to tell Lisa, how to handle the business transition, what kind of medical support I might need in the coming weeks. But underneath the logistics, I could sense something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. When Sarah finally left that afternoon, she hugged me longer and harder than she had in years. "I love you, Dad, and for what it's worth, I think your old shoes are perfect exactly as they are." After she was gone, I sat in my study, thinking about second chances and the strange ways that crisis can strip away pretense to reveal what's truly important. I picked up the phone and called Bill Stevens. "Bill, it's Robert. I need to make another change to my will." "What kind of change?" "I want to restore some of Sarah's inheritance. Not all of it. I still believe she needs to learn from consequences, but more than I originally planned." "What changed your mind?" I looked down at my old brown shoes, thinking about forgiveness and redemption, about the difference between punishment and teaching. My daughter came to see me today, and I remembered who she used to be. More importantly, I saw who she still could become. That evening, both girls came for dinner. Sarah had called Lisa and explained everything, and when they walked in together, I could see they'd both been crying, but there was something different in the air, a sense of purpose, of family unity that had been missing for too long. We spent the evening talking honestly about my condition, about the time we had left, about the things that mattered most. For the first time in months, I felt like I was sitting with my real family, not the polished, superficial version they sometimes presented to the world, but the authentic people I'd raised and loved. As the night wore on, Sarah looked down at my feet and smiled through her tears. "Dad, would you tell us the story of those shoes again? All of it this time?" And so I did, starting from the beginning, sharing not just the milestones they'd witnessed, but all the quiet moments in between, the walks with their mother, the pacing during difficult decisions, the steps that had carried me through a lifetime of love and loss. The shoes weren't just footwear anymore. They were a bridge between who we had been and who we were becoming, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that show their wear, that carry the marks of a life fully lived. In the remaining weeks I had left, I wanted to walk that bridge with both my daughters, to find our way back to what really mattered before it was too late. 3 weeks after my conversation with Sarah, I passed away peacefully at home with both daughters by my side. The cancer had moved quickly in those final days, but I was grateful for the time we'd had together. Time filled with honest conversations, shared memories, and the kind of authentic connection I'd feared we'd lost forever. Now, 2 weeks after my funeral, the family was gathered in Bill Stevens' office for the reading of my will. The mahogany-paneled conference room felt formal and cold, nothing like the warm study where I'd spent my final days with my daughters. But some rituals require official settings, and this was one of them. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. She'd been different since learning about my illness, more present, more genuine, more like the daughter I remembered from her childhood. But I knew she was nervous about what the will might contain. Despite our reconciliation, she was still the daughter who had mocked my shoes at Christmas dinner, and she knew there would be consequences for that behavior. Lisa sat beside her sister, occasionally reaching over to squeeze Sarah's hand. My younger daughter had handled my death with the same grace she'd shown throughout her life, organizing the funeral arrangements, coordinating with the business transition team, and somehow managing to be a source of strength for everyone around her. Also present were David, Sarah's husband, and Mike, Lisa's husband, along with James Murphy, who would be taking over as CEO of Morrison Industries. The formal reading of a will always felt like theater to me, but it served an important purpose. It made the transfer of wealth and responsibility official and legally binding. Bill Stevens cleared his throat and opened the thick document that would determine how my life's work would be distributed. "Before I begin reading the will itself," Bill said, "Robert left specific instructions about the order in which information should be shared. He wanted me to start with a letter he wrote to both daughters. He handed Sarah and Lisa each a sealed envelope, marked with their names in my handwriting. He asked that you read these now, before we proceed with the legal document." Both women opened their envelopes with trembling hands. I watched from whatever realm the departed observe such things, as my daughters read my final written words to them. Sarah's letter was brief, but heartfelt. "My dearest Sarah, by the time you read this, you'll know about the changes I made to my will, and you'll understand why I made them. But I want you to also know about the change you made in me during our last weeks together. When you came to my office that day and showed genuine remorse for your behavior at Christmas, when you chose to prioritize our relationship over appearances, you reminded me of the little girl who once cried over an injured bird. That little girl was still there, just buried under years of social pressures and misplaced priorities. The inheritance you're receiving is smaller than what you might have expected, but it's larger than what I originally planned after Christmas dinner. I hope the difference will teach you that second chances are possible, but they must be earned through genuine change, not just words. Use this money wisely. Use it to help others. Use it to remember that true wealth comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we give away and the love we share. I'm proud of the woman you became in our final weeks together. Hold on to her. All my love, Dad." Lisa's letter was longer, filled with gratitude and specific instructions about the family business and charitable foundation I was establishing in Margaret's name. But the essence was simple. She had always understood what mattered most, and I trusted her completely with the responsibility I was placing on her shoulders. Both daughters were crying by the time they finished reading. Sarah looked up at Bill, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Can I ask, how much did he change it? From the original plan?" Bill consulted his notes. "Initially, after Christmas, your father reduced your inheritance to $2 million. After your conversation in January, he increased it to $8 million. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Even the reduced inheritance was more money than most people could spend in a lifetime. "Lisa," Bill continued, "you're inheriting the remainder of the estate, including the family home, controlling interest in Morrison Industries, and the bulk of your father's investment portfolio. The total value is approximately $22 million. Lisa nodded solemnly, clearly understanding the weight of responsibility that came with such an inheritance. "There are also several specific bequests," Bill continued. "To Patricia Williams, his assistant, $50,000 and a full scholarship fund for her grandchildren's education. To James Murphy, a retention bonus and equity stake in the company to ensure continued leadership stability." He paused and looked directly at Sarah. "And there is one very specific bequest to Sarah Morrison Henderson." Sarah straightened in her chair, clearly puzzled. "To my daughter Sarah, I leave my brown leather shoes, the pair I wore to Christmas dinner in December, along with the hope that she will remember what I tried to teach her about the difference between value and price, between substance and appearance." Sarah began crying again, but these were different tears, tears of understanding, of redemption, of a lesson finally learned. "There's more," Bill said. "Your father left video messages for each of you. He recorded them several weeks before his death, and he asked me to show them to you after the will was read." He turned on a large monitor mounted on the conference room wall. My face appeared on the screen, sitting in my familiar study, looking directly into the camera with the intensity I'd brought to every important conversation of my life. The video messages played in sequence, first Sarah's, then Lisa's. Watching my daughters watch these recordings was like witnessing a masterclass in human emotion. Sarah sobbed through most of her message, particularly when I spoke about her childhood compassion and my disappointment in her adult priorities. But there was something cathartic in her tears, as if she was releasing years of accumulated guilt and misplaced values. Lisa's message prompted quieter tears, tears of gratitude and resolve. When I spoke about the responsibility I was placing on her shoulders, she sat up straighter, visibly accepting the weight of leadership I was asking her to carry. When the videos ended, the room was silent, except for the quiet sounds of crying and the hum of the air conditioning. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I want to see them. The shoes." Bill reached into a box beside his desk and pulled out my old brown leather shoes. They looked exactly as they had at Christmas dinner, worn, weathered, but still solid and functional. He placed them gently on the conference table in front of Sarah. She reached out and touched them tentatively, running her fingers along the cracked leather. "I remember the day he bought these," she said quietly. "I was 12 years old and he took me with him to the shoe store. He said he needed shoes that would carry him through important moments, shoes that would become part of his story." She picked up one of the shoes and held it to her chest. "I was so embarrassed by them at Christmas. I thought they made him look poor, unsuccessful. But they weren't about money or status. They were about history, about the journey he'd taken to build the life we all enjoyed." Lisa reached over and took her sister's hand. "He forgave you, Sarah. In the end, he forgave you, and even restored part of your inheritance." "I know," Sarah said, "but I'll never forgive myself for making him feel ashamed of something that should have made me proud." David, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. "What will you do with them?" Sarah looked at her husband, then at her sister, then at the shoes in her hands. "I'm going to have them bronzed and displayed in our home, where my children can see them every day. And I'm going to tell them the story of their grandfather. Not the story of his wealth or his business success, but the story of his character, his values, and what he tried to teach me about what really matters in life." She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city where Morrison Industries had been built. "I'm also going to change how I live. Dad was right. I lost sight of what was important. I became someone who valued appearances over authenticity, status over substance. But it's not too late to become the person he raised me to be." Lisa joined her sister at the window. "We'll do it together. The business, the foundation, the responsibility of carrying on his legacy properly." As the formal meeting concluded and family members began to leave, Sarah lingered behind. She picked up the shoes again and looked at Bill. In the video, Dad mentioned that these shoes had walked him through every important moment of his life. Do you think he would mind if I wore them sometimes, for my own important moments? Bill smiled, the first genuine smile of the afternoon. I think he would be honored, Sarah. I think that's exactly what he would have wanted. If this story has touched your heart, tell me from which place in the world you're reading this. The relationship between parents and children is universal, but the lessons we learn about love, forgiveness, and what truly matters transcend all boundaries. 6 months later, Sarah wore those old brown shoes to the groundbreaking ceremony for the Margaret Morrison Community Center, a project funded by the charitable foundation Lisa had established with their inheritance. As she stood at the podium speaking to a crowd about the importance of giving back to the community, she looked down at her feet and smiled. The shoes were still old, still worn, still showing every mile of the journey they'd taken. But now Sarah understood that this wasn't a flaw, it was their greatest strength. They told a story of a life well lived, of values that mattered, of a man who had learned to measure worth not by appearance but by purpose. In the end, the most valuable inheritance I left my daughters wasn't money or property or business interests. It was the understanding that true wealth lies in the love we give, the values we hold, and the legacy we leave in the hearts of those who matter most. And sometimes that lesson comes wrapped in an old pair of brown leather shoes that have walked through a lifetime of love, loss, triumph, and redemption. Shoes that finally found their way home to a daughter who learned, almost too late, what her father had been trying to teach her all along. The greatest gifts we give our children aren't the things we buy them, but the values we instill in them, and the love that guides them long after we're gone.